Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is July 2nd, 2024, and our class tonight will be on the communist position on the American Revolution. So what we will be learning today is a brief history on the lead up to the revolution, including the structure of the colonial government, the beginning of the revolution, and as well there will be a polemic section against ultra-leftism of the revolution. So before we go to our first section, which will be about the lead up after the 7 Years' War, just a quick introduction area. The colonial and revolutionary periods of American history are full of contradictions, internal and external. Internally, between the various classes, the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, proletariat, and slaves, between the colonists and indigenous peoples, between slaves and slave owners, and between women and the exclusion from suffrage and equality with their male counterparts. There were the external contradictions, as well, between the colonists and the British Empire, the British and French empires, the British bourgeoisie and proletariat against the monarchy and aristocracy, and between the British bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The history of the American Revolution is complex, and only through a process of dialectical and historical materialist analysis can the dynamics and the transient nature of this era be understood properly. All the contradictions stated above feed into the ebbing and flowing between progress and reaction. Understanding that level of consciousness is dependent on the modes of production and social being of humanity in its proper context is also important. This class serves only as an introduction into the revolutionary American period, and further independent reading is insisted upon. Communists have always held that the American War of Independence was the first installment of the American bourgeoisie democratic revolution, with the completion coming nearly a century later during the American Civil War and the abolition of chattel slavery.
All right, thank you. So we're going to hit a couple of things in this section, and what I want to start with is a overview, just summing up why the Europeans were interested in colonies in the first place. England, and we're going to focus on them because that's where our nation comes from, at least in this context, was rather late to the colonial game in comparison to, say, Spain, Portugal, France, even the Netherlands. But all the European nations, the primary motivating factor was to gain access to resources. So initially, the impetus after Columbus comes back is trying to get sea routes. The goal is to try to get to Asia quicker. So you may have heard in school about something called the Northwest Passage, this idea that there's a sea route that can get you around the Americas into Asia very quickly. Turns out that doesn't exist. But later, it's discovered that there's actually a lot of very valuable resources in the Americas, many of which are unique to the Americas. A lot of food, a lot of livestock, and of course, a lot of precious metals, things like that, in addition to things that just grow really well over here. Some of the goods produced used imported slave labor. These mostly used imported people from Africa, the captured enslaved people who were traded for it. If you look on the right, it may be a little blurry on your screen, but this is an overview of what we call the triangular trade during this period. It basically breaks this down. In the Americas, which are over here in the blue, what comes out of there is the resources. So this could be anything from sugar, lumber, fur, gold, whatever. That comes out of the Americas. It goes to Europe, where it is turned into a manufactured good. So cotton is grown in America, for example, but is then produced into a cotton cloth in Britain, and then that becomes like a shirt or a blanket or something like that, and then that is sold somewhere else. Sometimes that selling occurs in Africa, where those manufactured goods, particularly guns, are exchanged for humans and captured slave labor, who are then brought over to the Americans. So some goods are using slave labor, sugar, cotton, tobacco, things like that. But other goods, such as furs, are actually being used by Native Americans. So if you're up in the north, Midwest, around Canada, most of the Native tribes up there at this time were still kind of large because they're involved in the fur trading, and they were going to be better at this stuff than the Europeans ever were. So the Europeans just kind of let them do that job and just trade with them. And so there's a lot of variations here and there. Specifically, I also want to talk about the motivation for colonists, the people on the ground to want to immigrate over here to this quote unquote new world. Part of that is the seeking of a better life. Remember, this is still a pre industrial Europe and a pre capitalist Europe. So labor is not in high demand. So there's not a huge pull for workers to flee their medieval manor estates and flock to cities. But people want to escape and get a better life. Well, this offers them that opportunity. Most of whom will come over as indentured servants because they can't afford the ticket. So they will sell their labor and their personage for a few years in order to pay for that voyage. Usually it's about 7 or so years, and it's not transferable to a kid. So there's eventually a very big distinction that becomes between the enslaved African chattel slavery, which is permanent and passes to the children, and the indentured servants. That's another topic for another day. The main economic theory this time is mercantilism. And that, just to sum up real briefly, the idea is you need a lot of resources and you want a monopoly of those resources. So, Britain is in the tobacco industry, for example. It wants all the tobacco, ideally a monopoly on tobacco. So the colonies, from the European standpoint, were all about resource extraction. The colonies produced very valuable resources. That is the end for what the Europeans actually cared about what's going on in the colonies. That their territory is being protected, the royal power is being protected, and they're getting these resources. Colonists over there, however, see themselves as part of the mother nation. These are England's new territories, for example. So slowly over time, this contradiction will come into play. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to sum up colonial American government. The important thing to remember is it's modeled on the British form of government at the time. So at the top, there is an unelected head of the colony, the replacement for the crown, the monarch, on the ground of the colony, and this is the form of a governor. The governor is not elected, and they are appointed by the British monarch directly. So their job literally lies in the British monarch. Keep them happy, you get to keep their job. You don't keep them happy, you lose your job. And that's the end of it. They're responsible primarily for upholding the monarch's wishes in the colony, in particular to protect royal power. So this is at a time when the British monarch is going through a conflict with its own parliament, who has ultimate power, and this will be a struggle for about a century and a half or so until about the early 1800s, in which parliament's won and monarch doesn't get to do much. But at this point, the monarchs have some real influence, and they're trying to keep that going in the colonies as well. The governors can veto any legislation, anytime, no matter what. So keep this in mind when you think of all the conflicts that are about to happen. A colonial government can just get rid of it like that. They can also basically tell the assemblies, we'll get to them in a second, that they have to go home whenever they want, and they can call them back whenever they want to. So again, like the British monarch, does the parliament have to sit right now? Not technically. I haven't called it. So that conflict is also going to be there. Below the governor, you will have an elected assembly, and this will have a different name depending on your colony. So there's the Virginia House of Burgesses, there's the Massachusetts Court of Delegates. They all have different names. But basically, this is the equivalent of a legislature, right? A Congress, a General Assembly. Pretty much all of them, there might be some variations here and there, because again, all the colonies were a little different. But pretty much all of them were only open, i.e., the only people who could vote were property holding white men. And you had to actually own a substantial amount of property. It's not like, I can own a small quarter-acre plot of land and a log cabin in the woods. No, the idea was actually you're supposed to own enough land to be what they considered financially independent. You are not someone who really has to owe your labor to somebody else. So laborers, like your craftsmen, you know, shipbuilders, whoever, they're not getting the right to vote. Small farmers, they're not getting right to vote. Indentured servants, obviously. And that's, of course, other categories like women, they can't vote at all. Native Americans, who really would not have been considered part of the colony, they would have been considered like a foreign citizen. They're certainly not included. And of course, African Americans, whether they are free or enslaved. There are a few free African Americans at this time, um, so they would have been excluded as well. Um, Now, during this period, there's always a conflict between the governor and the assembly, and it's very similar to what's going on in Britain. Really, the argument is who has more power. And so, for the colonists, they're going to want to stick up for their assembly because at least there is some democratic process going on here, even though this is very much a upper crust of society body. This is not a even what we have in America today, very bourgeois form of government. This is even less democratic than that. But again, comparing it to the unelected governor, we can start to see that conflict. And once the American Revolution hits, you will see people, the governors, stick up for the British. So the guy in the bottom right there is Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts. And if you know your American Revolutionary independence, he is a stickler for the British position and doesn't make things easy for the citizens of Boston. He usually picks the British side, and he doesn't become a very likable guy in Boston. I think his house was attacked several times. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So that's kind of just brief summaries. There's a lot more to go into, but I want to also shift gears and talk about us as communists looking at the American Revolution, right? So we're going to go to, our two great thinkers and see what they have to say about it. So Lenin, in his letter to the American workers, states, "The history of modern civilized America opened with one of those great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars of which there have been so few compared to the vast number of wars of conquest, which, like the present imperialist war, referring to World War I, were caused by squabbles among kings, landowners, or capitalists over the division of usurped lands or ill-gotten gains. That was the war the American people waged against the British robbers who oppressed America and held her in colonial slavery. In the same way as these civilized, quote unquote, bloodsuckers are still oppressing and holding in colonial slavery hundreds of millions of people in India, Egypt, and all parts of the world." So that's Vladimir Lenin's take. Now let's also hear from Karl Marx in his address to the International Working Men's Association. This was a letter sent to Abraham Lincoln when he was president in 1865. "The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war, meaning the Civil War, will do for the working classes. They consider it an earnest epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world." Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, after the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War is also known as the French and Indian War. That might be the name you were taught in school. So this is the war that happens right before the American Revolutionary War. This is a war for colonial conquest. So across the globe, the British and French empires struggled against each other for colonial conquest. This war was fought in Europe, the Americas, and India, all over the place. From 1754 to 1763, the theater in the American colonies fought their segment, popularly known as the French and Indian War. For the British and their colonial governors, the war was meant to kick the French out and establish a monopoly of American commodity markets by the East India Company. So again, we hear that mercantilism, we need monopoly of all the resources coming out of the Americas. For the colonies, particularly in Pennsylvania and Virginia, the war was for access to the Ohio River Valley, which belonged to the natives who, at the time, went back and forth. A lot of them were trading with the French, and previously had traded with the Dutch. So, again, more land, more access to resources. The war cost 114 million pounds in 1763, equivalent to about $29 billion today. So this is where we're going to get those British government officials complaining about having to pay back the cost of the war. Head to the next slide. So, brief discussion of the class structure of colonial America. Of the nearly 3 million colonists in America, the breakdown by class can be roughly broken down as such. The largest class was the petty bourgeoisie, small property owners such as yeoman farmers, fur traders, small merchants, master craftsmen, artisans. They made up about 40% of the population. The proletariat, the landless laborers, such as the apprentices, laborers, indentured servants, farm workers, sailors, ship hands, made up about 20% of the population. Enslaved people made up about 13% of the population. And the rest were the national bourgeoisie, who were comprised of the slave-owning gentry, so the large slave-owning plantation owners, large merchants, land speculators, etc. The effects of the 7 Years' War. Up until the late 18th century, the American colonies had an agrarian economy. However, due to the richest gentry and due to the degrading soil conditions from inefficient tobacco plantations and farming, there was a need to utilize new fertile land. The American colonists, particularly the rich gentry, expected to gain access to the Ohio River Valley. But the British Empire instituted the Proclamation of 1763 to restrict westward movement in order to benefit British land speculators. And this is a quote from Herbert Aptheger from his book, The American Revolution. Moreover, this proclamation line, barring further American westward movement, temporarily the British promised, sought to favor British land speculators, as well as fur traders, and had blasted the hopes of the Ohio Land Company, in which George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, and George Mason were major investors, in favor of the British Vandalia Company. This cutthroat competition continued down to the days of the Revolution, so that, for example, Virginia land claims to acreage in present Kentucky and Ohio were threatened in 1774 by the Walpole Company, in which such figures as Lord Camden and the Earl of Hertford were invested, and which had been sponsored by George Grenville himself, the same man who was Prime Minister of Britain from 1763 to 65. The political and economic effects of the 7 Years' War. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. The removal of the French from the territory, the American colonists saw the true nature of the relationship with the British Empire. The colonists felt the weight of British policy in very concrete and provoking ways. They saw increased centralization of administration, enhanced militarization of colonial life, and the stationing of thousands of soldiers in America, increasing British restrictions upon established civil rights. They saw efforts to establish an episcopate in America, whittle away the political democracy that had been established in certain of the colonies and inhibit its appearance elsewhere, make the judiciary in the colonies quite independent of the colonists or their legislatures, vitiate the powers of the colonial legislatures in additional ways, particularly by curbing their power over the purse, i.e., money. Confine the colonists within a narrow strip of land hugging the seacoast, rigidly enforce the commercial and manufacturing restrictions. They saw an ever more prominent role being given to the British Navy. Trials without jury, established in certain colonial cases, swarms of office holders moving in from England to take over the American civil service, writs of assistance being issued and the sanctity of their homes violated, conveys of informers crowding the ports and being paid for bringing misery to others, new and burdensome systems of taxation concocted and levied, new restraints placed upon their economic development, and monopolies given to favored English companies or individualists summed itself up in the opinion of Thomas Jefferson, expressed in 1774 as, quote, a deliberate and systematic plan of introducing us to slavery, quote unquote. And this is again from Herbert Thinker. We'll throw it over to discussion.
Thank you, comrade. So we'll now break for our first discussion round. So if you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function and we will get to you as they go up. So first on my list, comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
All right, so really quick, first off, I live in Philadelphia, so obviously the 4th of July is a big deal here. And if anybody comes to visit, I'd be happy to take you to the Museum of the American Revolution, which is a great site. So much that it happens to be visiting, so we're going to go see it here in a couple days. So we'll report back. It's great. And then a quick question is, I am paying close attention to those quotes, but in a word, what was hoping to accomplish by restricting westward movement of the colonies? I don't think they cared much about the welfare of the indigenous peoples, but I don't know if I quite understand what was being communicated with those quotes. Thank you.
60 seconds. Thank you. So as part of what comrade mentioned in his section, it was a system that Parliament and the British back home were favoring British land speculators. And comrade, if you wanted to elaborate any.
Yeah, so that is definitely one thing. The colonists set up their own companies, but the British were really more interested in protecting British investors. So again, we see that split there. You're right in that they don't care about the Native Americans in the long run, but the natives helped them during the French and Indian War. And you have to offer your allies something. So in the short run, the British were also going to use this proclamation line to say, all right, we're not going to send any colonists that way. Like, hold the line. So it's a way of protecting their allies.
Thank you, comrade. I am, though, curious to know what did happen to the native communities that had supported the French and what was their fate after all that. Thank you. Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I did want to mention something about the quotes. The context was that this was like the beginning of the bourgeois nationalist era. So there was like that one small progressive character of ending the the rule of kingdoms throughout the world. So that was the one progressive character. Obviously, or rather, I say, the continuation of the genocide of Native American people and the still like Jim Crow process that was originated by chattel slavery is still in progress. So, overall, the American bourgeoisie are overall regressive, but there was that one progressive character of establishing bourgeois nationalism over British imperialism.
60 seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have two brief questions. The first is, so mercantilism. I've always heard this, and of course, this is like what sort of precedes the first capitalist era. Can we think of it as a predecessor of capitalism? Is there something about feudalism that it still holds on to? I've just wanted an explanation on that. My other question is in regards to sort of the makeup of these colonists. Like, what was the main waves of immigration from Europe that helped to build up this? Was it throughout the 1600s or was it more into the 1700s before the American Revolution?
Seconds.
I know that as far back as the 1610s or something, the Pilgrims were here. So I just was wondering about sort of the demographics of that.
Thank you. Comrade, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, briefly. Mercantilism is absolutely proto-capitalism. The biggest thing it gives to capitalism is it's a focus on accumulating capital. You want resources so you can get money. That needs to be its own class, but that's a very brief thing. So I won't delve into that. As far as demographics, the majority of, I want to say the majority, but big waves of migrants came in the late 1600s through the 1700s. Jamestown was struggled for the first 10, 20 years until tobacco really started taking off. New England Puritans didn't really bring a lot of people, but really post English Civil War, there was a lot of immigration, and there's also a lot of immigrants from all over Europe. So we had Jews, we had Muslims, because again, we're bringing a lot of enslaved people over from West Africa. Islam is big over there. There were Germans, Poles, Swedes, Irish, Scots, all kinds of people from Europe mainly.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Idaho, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yes. How did the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, how did that and Britain's transition out of feudalism, did that have any major effects on the political system of the colonies?
I think that's if my history is correct, that's a bit before this time here, and that was, I think, more closely related with the English Civil War. But Comrade, do you have an answer for that?
It's a little after the English Civil War. I'm not going to go to too much detail, but it's basically the Parliament basically starts establishing it is the most powerful body, but it still takes it probably about a century or so for it to finally establish that Parliament dominates British government. And the reason I say this, George III is still able to, during his reign, dismiss a government he doesn't like. It doesn't matter if Parliament likes it. He doesn't like the people in charge. He gets rid of them. Basically, when he dies, the British monarchs have no more power and influence. So it's a long process. The influence on the Americas would have been, again, strengthening the assemblies, basically.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade, do you have the floor? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to answer question on mercantilism. It's essentially the transition between feudalism and capitalism, just like you had it in every economic period. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the patricians hired barbarians to protect them from the slaves that were uprising, and later on these barbarians became the feudal lords. Then
30 seconds.
From capitalism to communism, you also have a socialist transition period. So mercantilism is the period where they accumulate capital for the later industrialization.
Thank you, Comrade. We will now go on to our next section now. Our next section will be on the Prelude to the Revolution, and Comrade, you have the floor for that. Go ahead.
All right. More passages of American Revolution by Herbert Aptheker. Curtis P. Nettles, in his valuable study, George Washington and American Independence in 1951, put this very well. British authorities after 1763 shuddered at the idea of democracy and could be counted on to oppose levelers and reformers in every conceivable way. If the colony should declare independence, they would be obliged to establish governments on a new basis of authority. Since the resistance was a popular movement, it was inevitable that new governments would rest directly on the people as a whole. To base government on popular sovereignty was to invite its complete democratization. Then farewell to the political power of the aristocracy, which owes its origin to acts of an English monarch and which had long been upheld by anti-democratic arts and practices. The nature of the colonial movement gave great impetus to the democratic argument. For if the colonial argument rested, 50, the American Revolution, on the injustice of the arbitrary power of the Parliament to rule, did not the same argument apply to those who, wherever they might be, were ruled by others over whom they had no control whatsoever. Thus, British apologists heaped ridicule on the colonial argument that parliamentary taxation was tyrannical, since the Americans had no representation in that body, by declaring that whole cities and boroughs and whole classes of British society also had no direct representation in Parliament, or could cast no vote for its members. Note, they were not called representatives. But these British apologists had logic on their side, only assuming a static quality to the political and social order. Nothing, however, is static, and certainly not political and social orders. For what happened was that in the colonies, the masses who had been deprived of the suffrage, who had suffered underrepresentation as those in the West, now demanded fuller political rights on the basis of the very arguments used by provincial assemblies vis-a-vis Parliament. And the British masses likewise raised the same demands. Here are two typical examples of such argument, and that they were published is at least as significant as the fact that they were developed. A Philadelphia mechanic contributed the following letter to the Pennsylvania Gazette, September 27, 1770. It has been customary for a certain company of leading men to nominate persons and to settle the ticket for assemblymen, commissioners, assessors, etc., without ever permitting the affirmative or negative voice of a mechanic to interfere. This we have tamely submitted to so long that those gentlemen make no scruple to say that the mechanics, though by far the most numerous, especially in this country, have no right to be consulted. That is, in fact, have no right to speak or think for themselves. Have we not an equal right of electing or being elected? I think it absolutely necessary that one or two mechanics be elected to represent so large a body of inhabitants. And here is a letter in the Pennsylvania Journal, April 5th, 1776. Do not the mechanics and farmers constitute 99 out of 100 of the people of America? If these, by their occupations, are to be excluded from having any share in the choice of their rulers or forms of government, would it not be best to class divisions and revolutions, 51, acknowledge the jurisdiction of the British Parliament, which is composed entirely of gentlemen? So far as the masses in the colonies were concerned, their democratic desires, correctly wrote Allan Nevins in his pioneering study, The American States During and After the Revolution, 1924, were among the springs which gave the revolutionary movement its irresistible power. The American Revolution was a result of the interpretation of three currents: the fundamental conflict in interest between the rulers of the colonizing power and the vast majority of the colonists, the class stratification within the colonies themselves, and the resulting class struggles that marked colonial history, which almost always found the British imperial power as a bulwark of the reactionary or the conservative interests in such struggles, and the developing sense of American nationality. The nature of the revolution transcending class lines, which resulted from the varied origins of the colony's peoples, their physical separation from England, the different fauna and flora and climate of their surroundings, their different problems and interests, their own developing culture and psychology and even language, their own common history, and from their own experience of common hostility, varying in degree with place and time, towards the powers that be in England. On the left is a unite or die, and the segments of the snake include the colonies, and let's see, I see Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, New Jersey, Vermont, Maine, Pennsylvania, New York, and I guess New England. Unite or Die, originally Join or Die, was a political cartoon by Benjamin Franklin, originally for the 7 Years' War, but revived in the lead up to the American Revolution. The Grand Union flag, adopted in 1775 and made obsolete in June 1777 after the Flag Act of 1777 was passed. It represented the unity of the 13 colonies against Britain. Quotes from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I have heard it asserted by some that as American hath flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, that the same connection is necessary towards her future happiness and will always have the same effect. Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. Alas, we have been long led away by ancient prejudices and made large sacrifices to superstition. We have boasted the protection of Great Britain without considering that her motive was interest, not attachment, and that she did not protect us from our enemies on our account, but from her enemies on her own account, from those who had no quarrel with us on any other account, and who will always be our enemies on the same account. Let Britain waive her pretensions, claims to the continent, or the continent throw off the dependence, and we should be at peace with France and Spain, were they at war with Britain. The miseries of Hanover last war ought to warn us against connections. Thomas Paine, under the portrait, he was an English-American Enlightenment era writer who supported the American and French revolutions. But Britain is the parent country, say some, then the more shame upon her conduct. Even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their families. Wherefore the assertion, if true, turns to her reproach, but it happens not to be true, or only partly so, and the phrase parent or mother country hath been Jesuitically adopted by the king and his parasites with a low papistical design of gaining an unfair bias on the credulous weaknesses of our minds. Europe, and not England, is the parent country of America. This new world hath been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe. Hither have they fled, not from the tender embraces of the mother, but from the cruelty of the monster. And it is so far true of England that the same tyranny which drove the first emigrants from home pursues their descendants still. And recommended further reading. Herbert Aptheker, The American Revolution, 1763-1783. Again, Herbert Aptheker, The Colonial Era, and Thomas Paine, Common Sense.
Thank you, Comrade. We will now break for our second discussion rounds. If you have a question or comment, please limit it to 60 seconds. I will let you know at 30, and we'll get to your hands as they go up.
Yeah, just that the slide before the last one that Thomas Paine had there. It seemed like his language was kind of directed at a slight against the papacy and the Catholic religion. And I'm curious if that was his intentions and why that would be.
So part of the whole mindset at this time was that the Catholic Church was the great power behind both the Spanish, maybe even the French empires and some other nations, where it was the superstition that it was a pope that led all these nations, not their kings or their peoples or whoever it may be. And part of at least from what I remember, for at least with the England, at least now, instead it was the Church of England, which the king was the head of that. But that was more almost kind of the same, just with a different kind of head. But there was still a large anti-Catholic bias, especially among a lot of Protestants, where they thought that everything that a papal conspiracy, in fact, was one of the things that may have ruled the world. And it looks like your hand's up, and you might want to elaborate better than I can.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. England in particular, well, England, Wales, and Scotland, well, and Ireland too, were still in about a century and a half long conflict over religion. That's part of the reason for the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution is there's a Catholic monarch, and that's not good. And when the monarch changed religions, that often meant death. But Thomas Paine also came from a very Protestant part of England, in particular the East Anglia area. That was the real hotbed of the militant Protestants, the Puritans, although he wasn't Puritan. So that was an area that remembered its history of the Protestant martyrs and things like that. So he's building off that because, again, his primary audience are the English colonists or English speakers, and they would have at least understood his language, like you said.
Thank you, comrade. If no other hands, we will go to our next discussion section. So this next section will be just a brief history of the start of the American Revolution. And comrade, that is your section. You have the floor.
All right. So the start of the American Revolution, the First Continental Congress. In the September and October of 1774, the delegates of 12 of the 13 British colonies met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to convene the First Continental Congress. Grievances against the king in Britain were issued. The meeting, for which were held at the Carpenter's Hall, and the event can be thought of as analogous to the first Congress of a revolutionary party today. There was much debate between the right and left in attendance about maintaining a relationship with Great Britain versus declaring independence from them. They settled on a compromise, the Continental Association, which banned British goods and called for fundamental rights for Americans, many of which would later translate into the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution. Also endorsed by the Congress were the Suffolk Resolves in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, which rejected the Massachusetts Government Act and urged colonies to raise their own militias against the British. In the battles of Lexington and Concord, the war itself broke out in the colony of Massachusetts in 1775. In February 1775, Massachusetts was declared to be in a state of rebellion by the British, and a British garrison set out to disarm the militias in Massachusetts. On April 19th of 1775, the British arrived at the town of Lexington, meeting about 80 militiamen assembled, including Minutemen. A shot was fired, most likely by British forces. This is known as the shot heard round the world. Many shots were fired back and forth following this. The American militiamen retreated to Concord, where more fighters were assembled, especially after they realized the British soldiers were firing ammunition from their muskets rather than just powder. These men had become skilled in guerrilla warfare, had a great knack, I guess, of the countryside, and allowing them to cover from
pursuing British forces.
Battles of Lexington and Concord continued, and at Concord, there were approximately 500 militiamen who had heard of the defeat of Lexington and prepared themselves strategically. 700 British soldiers advanced toward Concord and found themselves across the Concord River, about 90 soldiers strong at North Bridge. As they attempted an advance across the bridge, they were fired upon by the militiamen. And the British began to suffer heavy injuries and losses and eventually retreated. The militiamen assessed the situation, met with their families, and headed out, pursuing the British back to Boston. Many more battles occurred on the way back, including at Brooks Hill, Bloody Angle, Fisk Hill, and Minutamy, Watson Corner, and Charleston. At every battle, the militia force grew. And American militia forces grew from 500 at Concord to 15,000 by the time they surrounded Boston in the morning of April 20th of 1775. Therefore, now the Revolutionary War had officially begun. And then there's the start of the American Revolution, Second Continental Congress in Bunker Hill. On May 10th, 1775, delegates from all 13 colonies gathered for their Second Continental Congress. This same day, American forces captured Fort Ticonderoga, near what is now the southwest border of the states of New York and Vermont. This Congress would lead the Americans through the war and would be the revolutionary organ behind the Continental Army, which was established on June 14th, 1775, out of the Massachusetts militia and with George Washington as the general at its command. On June 17th, the Battle of Bunker Hill during the siege of Boston occurred. British forces captured Bunker and Breed's Hill, which were the ideal spots for American militia to assault the city. But this did not stop American forces from being able to access Boston. And so, the assault of Canada and war in America. We could see some graphic pictures there on the right, or one. And the Second Continental Congress sends the olive branch petition to King George III. But this is ignored, as he says the Americans are already in open rebellion and war against the British. And following the defeat at Bunker Hill, the Continental Army begins an expedition to capture Montreal and Quebec, led by no other than Benedict Arnold. I think he'll show up again later. Montreal is successfully captured, but Quebec is not. This ends the American entry into what would later be Canada. And battles begin taking place in the southern colonies too, such as South Carolina and Virginia. The war is intensifying and spreading at this point, and artillery from Ticonderoga is also being hauled to Boston for a final capture of the city. And a note of, here he is again, note of the treachery of Benedict Arnold, and this is by Earl Browder. Just as Leon Trotsky, who played a positive role in the October Revolution, just to portray the revolution, Benedict Arnold was a hero for the revolutionary cause early on to become a counter-revolutionary later on. Earl Browder wrote on Benedict Arnold in Traitors of American History, "First, there is Benedict Arnold, whose name takes its place alongside that of Judah for Americans as synonyms with the utmost depths of treachery. Arnold was a close intimate of George Washington. He was described as brilliant and gallant. He was ordered to be tried by court-martial by act of Congress, but was let off with a reprimand. Washington defended Arnold, disapproved of the court-martial, and afterward invited Arnold to resume a post of honor in the army, and on his request gave him command of the principal military post in the country, West Point. 1.5 years before receiving this appointment, Arnold was already in treasonable connections with the British. Within a few weeks after receiving the command, Arnold plotted to surrender West Point to the British at a date and hour when Washington, Lafayette, and others were to arrive at West Point. The plot failed only because the go-between, Major Andre, was caught returning through the lines with the documents of the plot. And Trotsky and his friends, a century and a half later, had learned to burn their documents. But Arnold escaped and openly joined the British, receiving a reward of $30,000 and a brigadier's commission. I guess that's a picture of him there. All right, now we are on the capture of Boston. And by January of 1776, the artillery from Ticonderoga, nicknamed the Noble Train of Artillery, led by Henry Knox, reached Boston. And the artillery was set up in Dorchester Heights, which was a great place overlooking the city to assault from. But in March of 1776, British soldiers attempting fire on the fortification, but could not reach it from their position. The only other alternative to ending the threat of the artillery was to assault it with troops. The British instead found their position indefensible and withdrew from Boston, taking their soldiers and supplies to Nova Scotia to prepare for a counterattack at a later date. American forces captured Boston, the last place the British actually controlled in the 13 colonies, and now held control over the entire territory and were prepared to declare independence in July. And now we're ready for discussions and new member introduction.
Thank you, comrade.
Thank you. Just a few little points about things, since I'm, from the area. There's a really nice trail that runs from Lexington down to through Concord, which is the beginning of that trail. That the troops follow when they chase the British out of the bridge. And there's a nice park by that where the shot heard round the world is in Concord. And also Concord is also home of Henry David Thoreau and the book Little Women. The family that came from was there, so it's sort of a center of intellectual thought in the 1800s in Massachusetts. Also, the fort is Ticonderoga, like a tie. And these are just things you learn growing up here. Thank you.
I don't know if you could do this because I was reading it, but I didn't have a moment to look at that map that looked like kind of like a battle tactic of the. Could you go back to that real quick? I'm just curious if we could just talk about that.
Is this the one that's around the areas of the March of Lexington and Concord?
Yeah.
Of Bunker Breed Hill?
The last one that we had, I think it was the second to last slide.
Second to last slide. Okay. Let me bring that up. Was it this one right here?
No, sorry. The one after, I think.
This one?
Nope, sorry. Maybe don't worry about if it takes up too much time to the right. Yeah, that one right there.
This one?
All right, I'm just trying to understand that because I didn't have time to look at it. I was reading, but I just want to see this because I was curious about it. So the English colonies, there were 13 colonies there in the right, and that was that light purple, and the other English colonies was basically everything else is what it looks like, right?
Everything to
Okay.
the east of the Mississippi River in Canada, basically, was what the British had claim over.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's all. Just
Not a problem.
Yeah. My question was, what were some of the main differences between the British and Continental Army in terms of structure? Because I know at that time, and I think this is still to a certain extent, and a lot of militaries, officers would get
Okay.
promotions based on seniority. Um, uh, 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 if you stayed for a certain number of years, every year you.
So what I can say at least is usually sometimes a lot of these officers, this was still when there was nobility and the kings. So if you are a descendant of a nobility or some other higher person of society, usually you just had an appointment as an officer, and common people rising up in the army, no such thing really. Battle tactics as well was a thing, as war was still considered a bit of a gentleman's sport, and the idea was both line up in straight lines at each other and fire. The whole idea that instead you crouch behind some kind of thing hidden in behind trees or a wall or something and take pot shots at the other army was not what they considered to be civilized warfare. Perhaps can you elaborate on that?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. So this is maybe not the first, but it's certainly one of the first prolonged uses of what we would now call guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics, very mobile forces. One of the big things to keep in mind too, Washington's biggest strength as a general was him knowing when to retreat and when to pull back and fight another day. That is what kept the army intact and alive. Washington would come out and attack, do enough damage, and then run away. And you might look at that and go, what in the world? Why can't you win a decisive battle? The one thing the Americans had was they're on their home territory. The colonists were in their own backyards. The British Army was mostly recruits from Britain or Germany or places like that. So they were homesick. They were not used to the climate. The thing they lacked was money and resources. Like, they starved at Valley Forge because Congress had no money to pay them. But Washington knew when to retreat. And that's a lesson for us as revolutionaries. Like, hey, we may want to win the victory tomorrow, but we also need to know when we need to pull back and fight another day. We can't run headfirst into a cliff of doom.
real quick question. This I think I read from Howard Zenn's book a long time ago on the history of the working people of America, whatever it was called. People's History of America. How brutal were the conscriptions, or like getting the people to be in the Revolutionary Army? My understanding is it was pretty gruesome. Like, they had to recruit people and they forced them into the military. Does anyone have any? That's kind of what I read from that book a long time ago.
30 seconds. I don't have any real answer against for at least the American side. I know in the British side, at least, there was the narrative of you were pressed the king's shilling, where basically if an officer pressed a shilling of the British with the king on it in your hand, then you were basically pressed into the army at that point, and they could just pick you up wherever. But from the American side, I don't really have an answer. I see some hands did pop up about that, though. Did you have an answer?
I don't think I can give a very good answer directly to that question. I will say something that I was kind of waiting for an opportunity to bring up. Where this came up during our class about the Easter Rising is the country was divided into three. And there was a third that supported the revolution. There was a third that opposed the revolution. and there was a third that was just caught up in the middle. So that's pretty typical as far as revolutions are concerned. And I don't know about the recruitment practices or whatnot, but I do know that there are the people who did join. It was a very uneasy alliance, if you can imagine, because there would be people, to my understanding, there were even Black people joining, and then they were fighting alongside other people who they would have been considered like slaves of in their colonies, as a rough example. So it was
35 seconds, please wrap up. Thank you. Comrade Massachusetts, did you wish to respond as well?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what the recruitment was, but I know one hint of that is that in colonial times in Massachusetts, the law was that all military age men had to keep a certain amount of powder. It had to have muskets and to keep a certain amount of powder and ammunition in their homes. It was required by law. And it was a military culture because they were, of course, constantly fighting the natives whose land they were taking over. And I think a lot of it came for that. So it wouldn't be a stretch for them to be joining in this fight.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade, did you want to respond as well?
I do, but I don't have a good answer for this question. I need to go do research on that. But there is one thing I want to hint at, which is the recruitment of African Americans. Both sides recruited them. And this is an example of maybe some of what I'm talking about. In the North, the Patriots really won over most Black people to join their side. They saw it as, hey, it's an extension of a fight for liberty and freedom, which is why after the American Revolution, you saw a bunch of the northern states abolish slavery. Massachusetts in 1780, for example, Vermont even earlier than that. In the South, that was not going to fly with most of the people who were serving, but the British came up with a plan to say, any slaves who run away and join us, you are emancipated. So there's this big split. In the South, most enslaved people went and fought for the British. In the North, they fought for the Unionists. And those Africans who fought with the British, unfortunately, things didn't end up very well for them. The British really didn't live up to all their promises or left them up in Nova Scotia to freeze.
Thank you, Comrade. Really quick, Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, a few highlights too. First of all, George Washington was able to handle a virtual army. He never knew what day how many people were going to show up. And that's because they had their own family and farms and whatever. And he was able to manage that fairly well. He also insisted, I found this absolutely interesting, that over one of the winters that he let all of the army, he let the army know he only wanted people that were already inoculated with the smallpox. Now, that was a scourge for that first year. And so during that winter, yes, a lot of people went through a whole bunch of inoculations so that could be ready to fight for the next spring. I thought that was very interesting.
Thank you. We will go on to our last section for time now. So our final section tonight is a section on a polemic against the ultra-left narratives on the revolution. And we'll be drawing primarily from some of Gerald Horne's works, as well as looking over some of what Henry Winston has written against some of the ultra-left tendencies on the revolution. So the communist movement around the world has always held the incomplete revolution theory, the theory that the American War for Independence was only the first installment, which would be completed with the American Civil War. The American Revolution ushered in the world bourgeoisie democratic revolutions, from France to Haiti, from Bolivar's Venezuela to Marti's Cuban Revolution, from Russian revolutions of 1905 and February 1917 to Vietnam's independence from France, and many more. The American Revolution transformed the world, While capitalism was developing already in countries like Britain, it was in the American colonies that the national liberation and democratic revolutions were born. Today, however, sections of the left have introduced the theory that the American Revolution was counter-revolutionary. The theory claims to be Marxist-Leninist, but guts the struggle of class struggle and national liberation. One of Gerald Horne's books, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, seems to be one of the bigger contemporary sources for disavowing the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. The central thesis is that the American Revolution was not a war fought for national liberation, but against abolition. This could not be further from the truth. Up until July 5th, 1775, 1 year before the Declaration of Independence, the American colonies had sought to avoid splitting from the British Empire. The British, who also used slavery, had just finished the 7 Years' War with France and Spain. It was experiencing crippling debt and relied on its colonies, especially the American colonies, to pay that debt. Does it really make sense that the British, who colonized and enslaved a large portion of the earth, are now willing to break ties with its colonies over the morality of slavery? Surely, the uniting of Europeans from various ethnicities under the umbrella of whiteness broadened immeasurably the anti-London project, with a handsome payoff delivered to many of the anti-colonial participants in the form of land that once was controlled by the indigenous, often stocked with enslaved Africans, not to mention a modicum of civil rights denied to those who were not defined as white. Ironically, the founders of the Republic have been hailed and lionized by the left, right, and center for, in effect, creating the first apartheid state. Ultimately, the main American colonies, model based on racial privilege, overwhelmed the London model based on ethnic privilege, London's ethnic approach implicitly, at times explicitly, sacrificed the interests of Irish and Scots and Welsh, and even the English of certain class backgrounds, and made up for the shortfall by seeking to attract Africans to the banner, a policy propelled not least by competition with Madrid. But such a policy could only alienate the mainland settlers, driving them toward a unilateral declaration of independence on July 4th, 1776. Throughout Horne's text, there is never a class analysis of the American Revolution. He simply holds the American people as monoliths represented solely by slave owners. Why does he do this? Horne does this because a class analysis would shatter his idealistic narrative. If he had done a class analysis, how could he explain the overwhelming support for the revolution by all classes? How could the leaders of the revolution, who were censored from the press by the loyalists, able to propagandize American proletariat and petty bourgeoisie to go to war and risk death and financial instability if they relied solely on grassroots propaganda campaigns? A class analysis would only harm this narrative. Another quote from Gerald Horne. These Africans played a pivotal role in spurning the once proud British subjects to revolt against the crown, thanks to the final colonial governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. He was viewed as a villain by the rebels, particularly after his notorious November 1775 decree to free and arm enslaved Africans in order to squash the anti-colonial revolt. Here, Horne is using the Dunmore Proclamation that lured slaves to the British war efforts as proof that the war was fought over slavery. However, this is merely a tactic of economic war against the colonists by destabilizing the economy. A tactic of war should not be confused with the objectives and principles behind a war. And another quote, in other words, from 1756 to 1763, London fought an expensive and largely successful war against Paris and Madrid to oust the latter two from a good deal of North America to the benefit of the colonists, then sought to raise taxes to pay for this gigantic venture, only to have the settlers go behind the back of London and conspire with Spain and France against Britain. In this quote, Horne shows that his apologia to the British monarchy by glorifying the valiant effort of the British to defend the colonies from the French and Spanish. How absurd. Horne has it completely backwards. The colonies were dragged into a war that had been serving British interests for decades prior. The British did not care about the colonists. It was worried about monopolizing the market for itself. And from Henry Winston, and this is from Strategy from a Black Agenda, it seems paradoxical that the recent avalanche of books and articles portraying the black condition in the U.S. as that of a colony has been issued by the same monopoly-controlled book and newspaper publishers who use most of the rest of their ideological output to deny the imperialist nature of U.S. state monopoly capitalism. It seems paradoxical, but it is not. This development marks a new state of sophistication in the ideological offensive of U.S. imperialism. The colony theory is particularly useful to the monopolists because it appears to be so radical. In fact, it contains the admission that the oppression of Black people in the U.S. is comparable to the colonial oppression in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This emphasis on the intensity of Black oppression gives the colony theory its ring of authenticity. But this admission of oppression is not as candid, one might even say benign, as it may seem. By promoting the colony theory, the white ruling class aims to define and determine the direction of the Black liberation movement. In yet another form, the monopolists are striving to prevent Black people themselves from defining the specific features that constitute the special oppression they experience. By analogy, this theory directs attention to those aspects of Black condition in the U.S. which are most closely resemble the colonial conditions. These similarities are so powerful that one's attention might be diverted from what is unique in the status of the triply oppressed Black peoples in colonial or semi-colonial situations, past or present. Via the colony analogy and variations on this unscientific anti-Marxist theme, U.S. imperialism's ideologists are trying to influence the Black liberation movement into adopting a self-defeating strategy. While the U.S. internal Black colony theory resembles a winning strategy for an oppressed majority living in a colony, it would mean certain defeat for an oppressed minority, which has indeed been the Black condition for more than 350 years in this part of the world. The supposedly revolution, even so-called Marxist, books on the colony analogy, now in mass circulation, were written by white radicals who have abandoned the struggle against racism, and by Black radicals who seek rhetorical shortcuts to liberation. By portraying the status of the Black people in the U.S. as a colony, these radicals assist the ruling class's aim of diverting Black liberation movement from a winning strategy, one that would advance the self-organization of the Black liberation movement and simultaneously combine this independent strength with that of allies, the working class, Black, brown, yellow, red, and white, together with all the poor and exploited, in a new formation. This is the basis for an anti-monopoly coalition, the only strategy that opens the way to a future without racism, exploitation, poverty, or oppression. Among the radicals, Black and white, who have popularized the colony theory are Eldridge Cleaver, Huey Newton, Reggie Debray, James Forman, Tom Hayden, Harold Cruz, James Boggs, Stokely Carmichael, and Robert L. Allen. It is ironic that many of these radicals claim that Marxism is European in origin and must be revised in order to apply to the Black people in the U.S., advance theories based on revisions of Marxism by such Europeans as Herbert Marcuse, Leon Trotsky, and Regis Debray, as well as Trotsky-like revisions to be found in the thought of Mao Zedong. It was especially under the influence of Marcuse and Maoism that the New Left radicals began to be attracted to one or another pseudo-revolutionary theory, including the concept of an internal colony of Black people in the U.S. While Marcuse's ideas are not identical with the thought of Mao, the view both stimulated anti-Marxist misconceptions of the world revolutionary process, the historical role of the working class and its relationship to the liberation struggles of oppressed people, and the imperative need for the strategies based on the specific features and historical development of each country, each working class, and each national liberation movement. During every upsurge in the people's struggle, especially those of mainly working class Black people, there is a more extensive activation of countermeasures designed to sustain disunity and block allegiance between Black and white workers, together with Black people as a whole, against corporate monopoly. And the rest of it was kind of cut off there. Apologies. And so we'll go to our final discussion round and wrap up. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please use the raise hand function. Comrade, you have not spoken tonight. You have 60 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to say Gerald Horne's ideas are very popular in today's day and age. People just, say, oh, America is this terrible nation. It doesn't have any good history. Everything is just bad, bad, bad. And it's kind of sad. It's kind of sad. Even some of the people who are like the biggest critics of our party on the internet, at least, are support Gerald Horne. So yeah, that's all I just wanted to say. It's a shame that his views have and his ideas have have gone all over the place. So
Well, I think it's as Comrade Angelo has once said, one person can be good one time, and then the next time they could be something completely different.
Yeah, so I wanted to just point out something about the revolution. A lot of people might make criticisms of us and go, oh, everything that you're saying for the American Revolution, you could just apply to Israel. But personally, what I've seen is that the key difference in between those wars of independence was that the American Revolution was actually chiefly against British military forces, British army people, and their indigenous proxies versus and is the Israeli War of Independence, it was against
3 seconds.
Perceived Arab proxies of British imperialism rather than against actual British military forces in the region. So I think there's a clear difference between the American Revolution and the supposed Israeli one. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Comrade. You have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know how much I can say here. But when uh, uh no, I chalk this up mainly to my inactivity in this uh uh uh, 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 body.
30
But
seconds.
we were working on something for the party, and uh, it, one of the big things that some of our comrades are still struggling with is the internal colony theory.
60 seconds. Please wrap up.
I have to come up with a more candid way.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we need to go to closing announcements. I apologize if we did not get to your hands, but we do need to wrap up to the final sections and announcements.
Yes, please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You can find a lot of great works, and of course, buying works through New Outlook Publishers helps support the school. Our latest release was released today, Marxism and Modern Idealism by John Lewis. It's a great work. In fact, we had a class on this work in the past, so please check that out. Some works relevant to tonight's class. Lenin and Stalin Speak to America. Within this book, you can find Lenin's Letter to American Workers, The Heritage of Jefferson. Also something you don't see here. That little blurb that we had from Browder on Traders of American History. You could find that in selected works on the Moscow trials. And of course, in a few weeks, if you could remind the date, the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies will be doing a class on the book Fascism and Social Revolution. So please get that book soon, and you could read along with us in the class, and you could have a better understanding before we even start the class. Once again, you can find all these great works at newoutlookpublishers.store.
Thank you, Comrade. We do have to end class right there, though. So thank you, everyone, for coming by tonight. Have a great rest of the week. Take care.